Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my entire sketching process for this old pair of boots pen and ink piece, starting from my preliminary freehand graphite sketch or my preliminary outline sketch, if you will, all the way to using alternative shading and mark making techniques with my pen. Now, a couple of things before jumping into it. Number one, make sure to check out the resources that I'm going to be linking to, both blog posts and past videos that I've created. Those are especially for beginners that are just getting started with freehand sketching as well as pen and ink. I highly recommend checking those out if you're just getting started, because in those resources, I provide must-know information and even exercises that are going to facilitate this process of drawing something like what I am drawing today. Learning about those things and practicing those types of exercises first is, in my opinion, a must so that you can succeed at more advanced drawings. So make sure that you check those out, especially if you're just getting started, because if you try to jump straight in with no previous knowledge or preparation, it could really make things just more frustrating for you, and I don't want that. The second thing is I'm gonna make sure to leave timestamps to the different parts of this video, the freehand sketching part, and also where the pen and ink phase begins down below in the description box in case you'd like to skip on over to a specific part of the video. And lastly, as always, you're going to be able to find links to the different supplies that I'll be using to create this piece today down below in the description box. All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight into it. So I am using an HB drawing pencil very, very lightly. I am super sorry if this looks very light on screen. It'll look a little bit darker in a bit. It's just that this is the level of darkness that I like using when I am in those beginning stages of my preliminary pencil sketch, so that I can easily erase mistakes, do any refinements as needed, and it's also important for me to draw lightly so that I don't scratch or damage my paper. And just so you're aware, this method that I am going to be walking you through is the exact same method, and these are the exact same things that I make sure to have in mind. It doesn't matter what it is that I am drawing, whether I am drawing an object, an arrangement of objects, an animal, a landscape, whatever it is that I am drawing, these same things come into play. So what you're seeing me do right now is I am laying down envelopes. I like referring to them as envelopes, and all it is, it's just simple blocky shapes. I am imagining my subject or my object wrapped in wrapping paper, or imagine that you have a big block of marble and you're going to be chiseling away that excess material to reveal that subject underneath, okay? So imagine these big blocky shapes kind of drawn out around your subject. I like initially laying these down as straighter lines so that I can think more of it in terms of the major angles created, but you can ultimately also use a combination of curves and straighter lines. It doesn't really matter, but simplify what it is that you're looking at. Tune out all of the unnecessary details. Focus on the general largest shapes. In this case, you probably notice how I even laid down one same envelope and then divided it into the two boots. Make sure that these big blocky simplified shapes are the size that you want them to be, and also in the location in your drawing space where you want them to be. Oftentimes, what I see beginners do is they focus on the smaller details, and then their drawing ends up being way too large and doesn't fit in their paper, or way too small and there's a bunch of negative empty space around the subject, or it ends up being way too far on the right or way too far on the left. And one tip here is, if you're having trouble using your drawing space effectively, lay down a straight vertical right down the center of your paper and a straight horizontal right in the middle of your paper, so that you can have those 4 quadrants there for you. You can do this on your reference photo as well. Just draw that vertical and that horizontal right in the middle, so that you can have that, what I like referring to as a 4-quadrant grid. And by seeing this, by having your reference image divided into 4 quadrants for you, as well as maybe even having that vertical line and that horizontal line straight down the middle of your drawing space, you are going to have guidance, extra support, training wheels even. This is going to help you develop those freehand drawing skills, those visual measuring skills as well. It's going to help you utilize your space a lot more effectively. And honestly, as humans, our brains understand straight vertical lines and horizontal lines and right angles a lot more easily than irregular shapes with irregular angles. And we have a little bit of an extra support with those lines there, because we can compare straight lines or right angles to irregular angles that we see in the created by those shapes. And we can just compare things a lot more easily in terms of their alignments, in terms of their placements within space, in terms of how tall things are in relation to each other, how wide things are in relation to each other. And it's just an extra support for both developing your ability to measure things out visually, to recreate effective proportions, and also in terms of utilizing your drawing space more effectively. So help yourself with that 4-quadrant method, especially if you're just getting started with freehand sketching. It's going to help you a ton. And later on, you're going to be able to create sketches without always laying down those 4 quadrants. All right, so right here you can see me get started with what I would call medium-sized shapes inside of those larger shapes. So I finished up with my initial envelopes. So I started with one, I then divided that one into the 2 separate boots. I really noticed that negative space in between the boots, that shape created with the negative space to separate those boots. And then I did a few refinements here and there in those envelopes, really acknowledging, comparing heights, comparing widths, comparing little irregularities that I wanted to make sure that those envelopes presented in terms of their angles and alignments of lines and stuff like that. I erased and refined along the way. And then now what I am doing is I am starting to add in what I would refer to as medium-sized shapes inside of those envelopes. And for me, it really is all about simplifying. It's all about acknowledging what I am looking at as a combination of simple shapes and or simple 3D forms. If I am going to be developing a sense of 3D-ness and some sort of realism, whether I am going to be shading it in or painting it, it's important to acknowledge what you're looking at as having 3D form, having mass, having volume, and not being flat shapes. But it's really all about simplifying what you're looking at and acknowledging it as a combination of simple shapes or forms, and tuning out all of those minor details until after those largest shapes have been achieved. That is the key for me in order to arrive at effective proportions. Focus on the whole, focus on the largest shapes and forms first, and then make your way towards the smaller details only after you've made time to check on the proportions of those largest shapes. And then as you move along, adding in more shapes and more details, you will have more points of comparison. You're going to notice that once you add a new shape, you all of a sudden maybe have to make something larger or something smaller, or you have to move a line a little bit more to the left or to the right or up or down or whatever it is, because you now have more points of comparison. And that is normal and it's totally okay. As you move on practicing your freehand sketching, those errors in proportions and locations of all of these elements that you start adding in become smaller and smaller and easier to fix, and you're gonna be able to notice them a lot more quickly. So it really is all about developing those observational skills and constantly comparing your sketch to your reference photo back again over and over and over again, comparing heights, comparing widths, comparing locations of elements within space, and continuing to refine as you go. Make sure that you continue using your pencil lightly so that you can easily erase mistakes and you don't leave behind any marks on your paper that are gonna affect the final result. In this case, I know that I am going to be moving on to pen and ink mark making and shading techniques. And I want to make sure that at the end, when my ink dries, I can erase my graphite and I don't have any traces of graphite left behind or scratches on my paper. Okay, so I am pretty much done with the medium shapes, and as you can see, I am now moving on to the smaller details. And these little circles, these holes in which the shoelaces go into, I really had to pay attention to because they are not flat circles, they're not perfect circles, they're actually more like ovals or ellipses, different ellipses depending on the perspective of that little metal ring in that leather. The way that that old beat up leather is curving and creating both concave and convex areas within the structure of that boot, it affects the way that we see those ellipses, and it's important to acknowledge that. And so I wanted to make sure not to go in and do what my brain would tell me to do if I were drawing this completely from imagination and not paying attention to my reference, which would be to go in and just draw perfect little circles, because that would take away from the realism of the piece. And also, to be honest, it would take away from the interest of the piece, because these ellipses create interest in the piece. They create variety, and variety makes the piece look more interesting. Something that really drew me to this photo is not only the shape, the irregularity, and the imperfections throughout the boots themselves, but also how the shoelaces are overlapping and creating just different loops and shapes throughout them. And also these metal little rings. The variety in these ellipses also creates a lot of interest in the piece, and so I wanted to make sure to capture that. Right here, you can see how after adding in those little holes, I am now getting started with adding the shoelaces. And for this, I want to share with you guys that I actually zoom into the photo, this particular section, in Photoshop when I am working on smaller details at this point in the freehand sketching process, or am just simply working on a subject that has a lot of overlapping shapes that are difficult to make sense of. I zoom into that area in my photo editing software and focus on that area, because it's very easy to get lost and overwhelmed, especially when you have so many shapes overlapping and stuff. And I really wanted to make sense of those loops, not only of the overlapping, but also of the loops going on in those shoelaces. So take your time with it. Don't allow yourself to get overwhelmed, because again, these are nothing but shapes. And if you focus in on one single area and tell yourself to not move on to the next thing until you finish this, sometimes it's just very helpful, because in the beginning we tend to be very excited. We want to move on to the next part of the process. And that, in my opinion, is a big mistake, because this work that we're doing right now with this preliminary freehand phase is the foundation for everything else. And if we don't spend enough time on it and there is some sort of faulty foundation, some mistake there, no amount of paint, if we're going to be painting, no amount of detail, no amount of shading, if we're going to be moving on to shading realistically with graphite, that is not going to fix a faulty foundation. So train yourself to take your time with your sketch, and when it comes to working on more complex areas, focus in, zoom into that area, and just break it down so that you can build it back up efficiently. All right, I am just finishing up with these last details on this boot on the right. And before finishing up with this part of the process, I just want to say here There is absolutely no shame in starting a pen and ink piece, or what you know is going to end up as a pen and ink piece, with graphite pencil first. Personally, I really like making sense of what it is that I am drawing before moving on to the permanence of pen and ink. And not only this, but a lot of the alternative shading, the mark making techniques, it still requires a lot of skill to do, even if you lay down this initially with graphite. All right, so it's time to get started with the second part of this drawing process, which is the pen and ink phase. I am going to be using my Staedtler pigment liner, and this is in 0.1. And the first thing that I am doing is I am defining some of the edges, the outer edges mostly, of these boots. Now, notice how I didn't say the word outline. The word outline, as many of my students and community members already know, it doesn't bother me. I just don't want to give off the wrong impression that I am outlining anything. And the reason why I am very careful about using that word is because oftentimes when I say outline, beginners get the idea that an outline is a perfect line created all around the shape with one same consistent line weight all throughout. And that is not the case at all. I'm really trying to avoid that, actually. If you notice, I am defining the edges around some of the shapes here, especially the largest ones at this point. But in many cases, those lines are not even connected. And I am trying to work a little bit faster because I know that by laying down those lines relatively fast, I am going to arrive at a greater line weight variation throughout those lines so that I don't have one consistent thickness from one end to the other end. In my pen and ink tips for beginners video, I explain all about line weight variation and why it's so important to develop line weight variation in your pen and ink pieces. Line weight variation refers to having a heavier visual weight along some sections of your lines and marks, meaning them being heavier, so like darker and or thicker, versus having other sections of your lines and marks being lighter in visual weight, meaning thinner and lighter. And making mindful use of line weight variation can really bring a lot of interest, a dynamic look into even the simplest of sketches, and it helps you stay away from the flatness of consistent outlines and the heaviness that that can bring, and also stay away from that coloring book page look. Of course, if that's what you want to do, then that's a totally different thing, right? If you're going for that look, then go for it. In that past pen and ink tips video for beginners, I mentioned a few things that are super important for you to have in mind consistently as you're moving through your pen and ink process so that you can just have greater control of your line weight variation. And these 4 things are taking into account the pen tip size that you're currently using. So larger pen tip sizes are obviously going to lead to starker, heavier, thicker overall lines. So when I was first getting started with pen and ink, for example, I used to love thicker pen tip sizes, but at this point in my journey, I think I prefer 0.3 and even smaller than that. But you can also think of varying your pen tip size throughout the drawing process, because that, of course, in and of itself can help you develop different line weights throughout your drawing, right? Just varying your pen tip sizes, just taking into account the effect and the impact that using a smaller pen tip size versus a larger pen tip size can have on your outcome. The second thing, as I said before, is the speed at which you're moving your wrist and your arm. Because if you're doing everything very, very slowly, that is most likely than not going to lead to stiffer looking lines and may even lead to stop and start marks. I'm not personally looking for that kind of thing throughout my lines. So the quicker you move your wrist and your arm, the more tapered out those lines tend to be, so the thinner their ends tend to be. And honestly, from what I've learned is that I'd rather have a bit of a wobble or a bit of an imperfect line, but have a variation throughout it in terms of that line weight, versus having a very stiff, straight, perfect looking line that is not going to lead to a very interesting dynamic look. Another thing that really affects you being able to develop a line weight variation in your work is the angle at which you're using your pen. I'd highly recommend exploring and practicing using your pen in more of a right angle, like perpendicular to your table that you're working on, versus at a 30-degree angle, 45-degree angle, etc., because that also has a great impact on how thin and how thick your lines end up looking. And finally, of course, there's also the pressure that you're exerting on your paper as you're drawing with your pen. So if you exert a greater amount of pressure, then your lines are probably going to look thicker, versus if you just are lighter on that pressure and are barely touching the tip of your pen to your paper, that is going to lead to a thinner look. So these 4 things all have a great impact, and as you continue practicing with drawing with pen and switching and shifting these 4 things as you're moving along in a mindful way, later on, you're gonna do it subconsciously without even knowing as you move along in your drawing process, depending on what you're drawing and the overall look that you're going for. So remember, making sure that you are varying your pen tip sizes along the way, or varying the way that you're using only one pen. If you're using only one pen, can have a great impact on your line weight variation. Also, the speed at which you're moving your wrist and your arm, the angle at which you're using your pen, and the pressure that you're exerting on your pen. These are all things that you have to stay conscious of along the way. So I am just finishing up right here with this first part of the pen and ink process, which is defining those edges. The hardest thing for this part of the process for me was making sure that I was skipping over certain sections of lines in that pencil work in which those lines were actually being overlapped by another shape, so I didn't really have to trace that line with my pen. So in other words, because of the ink's permanence, because we're not going to be able to erase the ink, it's even more important to really analyze whether you actually have to trace over certain sections of your pencil work or not. Because if that line is actually being covered up or overlapped, if something is on top of the line, then that line should not be visible, right? And because of all of that complexity amongst the shoelaces, especially with the loops and all of the overlapping shapes, I really had to stay mindful of that, of where sections are actually covering each other up, and I don't really have to trace over that pencil work. All right, and right here I am getting started with my alternative shading and mark making techniques. So before getting started with the second part of the pen and ink process, I actually took a step back and I just took a note of what specific alternative shading and mark making techniques would help me both create texture as well as develop some values throughout this sketch, so that I could stay mindful along the way and stick to those alternative shading and mark making techniques that I planned for myself. Because otherwise, that's when things become really messy when you're working with pen and ink. There has to be some sort of consistency in those alternative shading techniques. And so what I decided for this particular subject was to use contour lines and also cross contour lines, maybe a little bit of hatching and cross hatching, and just to finish up darkening darkest dark areas, I would be going in with some scribbling. So what you're seeing me work on right now is I am working on my contour and cross contour lines. Initially, I like going in with just one layer of contour lines all throughout. And for that, if you are asking yourself what curve to use for those contour lines, which by the way, I highly recommend checking out my guide on alternative shading and mark making techniques. Again, I go into I think the 6 major or most common alternative shading and mark making techniques, and I explain them all in detail and also exercises that you can do with them all. But these are contour lines. They are curved lines, and you really have to take into account the structure, the 3D structure of what it is that you're drawing when you're using contour lines. And I thought about using contour lines in this particular case because of all of the curves going on throughout this leather. I knew since the beginning that by using those curved contour lines, I would be enhancing the curves, all of the curves throughout these boots. So initially I went in with just one layer of my curved lines. And then once I was happy with that first layer, I went in with doing my cross contouring. And for the cross contouring, you're basically laying down intersecting curves to those previous curves. So if you think about it in this way, contour lines are basically one group of curves. They're similar and consistent in that curvature, and also they're somewhat consistent in the distance that they have between each other. And then when it comes to the cross contouring, you lay down a second group of curved lines on top of that first group. And again, in that second group of curves, there has to be a consistency in that type of curve that you're laying down and also the distance between the curves. And when I am working on an area that is relatively light in value, I may just go in with contour lines, with just one group of contour lines. And if I want to darken certain areas within that, I go in with cross contouring on top of that. So the main thing with pen and ink, if you're going to be shading and using alternative shading techniques with pen and ink, it doesn't really matter what alternative shading technique you're using. What's important to understand is that you have to be able to pinpoint the different values in your reference photo. So you have to stem from a quality reference photo that allows you to see lights, midtones, and darks. Okay, so select a photo with great lighting. And then based on those values that you see in the reference photo, you're gonna be laying down a lesser amount of ink or none at all in lighter value areas, a medium amount of ink in mid-tone areas, and a greater amount of ink in darker value areas. Being able to develop different values, seeing them in your reference photo or whatever you have in front of you in real life so that you can make them happen in your drawing, is what is going to make something look more believable. Its value is really what gives something a sense of 3D form. And so it's essential that you keep observing that reference and understand those different values so that you can make them happen via your alternative shading and mark making techniques in your drawing. So all it is you are covering a greater amount of paper with your lines and your marks in darker value areas, and you're covering up a lesser amount of paper in your lighter value areas. Something that helps me is working on the global picture and making sure that I am protecting those areas of lightest values, that I am not going to be adding nearly any ink in at all. And then I start developing lighter midtones and then darker midtones, and I push my way towards darker darks as I move on. And I can choose to go in to add a greater amount of detail with specific little types of marks. Like for example, right here, I just thought of creating these lines for seams and also for the zippers. These aren't really alternative shading techniques. They're more mark making that I choose specifically for certain spots. I usually love ending with scribbling at this point, which is what I am doing right here, just to push those darkest values in little areas because with the scribbling, I can go in with tighter little loops, and because these loops are tighter, I thus cover up a greater amount of that whiteness of the paper, darkening those darkest dark areas in a very imperfect, irregular way. And what I love about scribbling is that, yes, you're laying down more ink in those tighter little loops if you choose to do them in a tighter way, but at the same time, you're leaving teeny tiny little specks of paper so I don't create flat, like negative spaces or negative holes in my drawing. You can see the difference right there between the two boots. The one in which I've pushed those darkest values in with my scribbling looks already a lot more 3D than the other one. Why? Because it has a greater value development created throughout it, from very light lights to a wide range of midtones to very dark darks. Whereas the other one has yet to be pushed in those darker value areas. As you're moving along doing your alternative shading, it's so easy to go overboard with the amount of marks that you start laying down. So something that really helps me is continuing to take breaks along the way and analyzing everything from a further away distance, and really asking yourself if more marks are really necessary. All right, so I'm just finishing up with a few little quick details here that I want to add into the boots. And just to finish up this piece, I'm going to be adding the ground line to situate the boots in place. And also to help with this, I'm going to be adding a little bit of a cast shadow beneath the boots. And I decided to just go in with some hatching. So hatching is nothing but basically straight parallel lines, and they can be in any which angle you choose, as long as there is a consistency within those lines. There has to be a consistency in terms of the angle that that line is laid down in, and also again in the distance between the lines. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!